Welcome to Breeze Time with Kathy. We're going to continue with part 2 of my journey to Greece that I took while I was still in seminary. And as I said before, this was my very first trip to Europe. I made it as a seminary student back in, I guess it had to be 2002. And my husband was still alive then, so we traveled together. I hope you enjoy. Well, this is part 2 of my trip to Greece that my husband and I, Chuck, took in 2002. I was still in seminary. It was my very first trip overseas, and I was oh so excited. The focus, of course, I was traveling with my New Testament professor, Dr. Ben Witherington, and it was called In the Footsteps of Paul in the Study of Early Christianity. We continue now with a visit to an icon factory. It's not really an icon factory, it's a monastery, and they produce icons. Now, these are monks who specialize, they're Orthodox monks, and they specialize in producing icons. They do it with the traditional methods using egg tempera paints. And we got to watch them work. It was really, really fascinating. One of the first things they do after they prepare the surface is that they lay down gold leaf because they believe, you see, you're supposed to use it as a source of meditation. It's as if you're looking into a window in heaven. And they believe that all the light in heaven is made of gold. And it's to help you focus as you pray. Remember, it was my birthday the day before we went here. And so my husband bought me this icon, which is the Last Supper. Now, if you look at it, remember, icons were designed to help people remember Bible stories. Many people could not read, but it tells the story of the Last Supper. Here we have Judas. Judas is the keeper of the purse. He turns away because he's getting ready to leave. There's a basin and a pitcher that reminds us that Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. There's John the Beloved leaning on Jesus' arms. Here's Peter, traditionally shown on his right side, because Peter said, Lord, I would not desert you. And he said, Peter, before the cock crows 3 times, you will have denied me 3 times. Everyone at this table will desert me, and you will deny me. And of course, here is the wine and the bread for the establishment of the Lord's Supper, symbol, the elements of the symbols of the new covenant. So it shows everything that you would need to help you remember the story and to meditate on it. I have this icon and I value it. I really do. It's a wonderful birthday present. A very special one. Well, we traveled from where the Meteorae are all the way down to Corinth. If you look at it, Corinth, this almost would be an island, except there is a little bit of land that connects it right here. And that's called the Isthmus of Corinth. And at the time of, in the 1st century, now there's a canal that's dug there. But at the time, there wasn't a canal. Instead, though a canal was proposed, it was never dug until modern times. And this is the canal right here, as you see. And kind of dramatic. But it does allow you to, saves you a lot of time at sea to go around it. We stopped at a restaurant and had lunch. And here's my husband Chuck and I. And we're sitting there by the isthmus, by the canal at Corinth. And here they're bringing a ship through the canal. It was really very impressive. And as I said, it saved ships a lot of time. But at the time of Paul, what they did was they built this road right here. It was a paved road. This area is relatively flat, and they would tow the ship across on rollers. Do you see right here? This is an example of what it was like. And they would tow ships across the isthmus. It's quite amazing what they did. The ancient people were quite clever. This was a real engineering feat. And these ships would then be put back at sea, and off they would go. It was amazing. Now here we have the ruins of ancient Corinth. Now you remember Paul wrote 2 letters we know that we have that are still in existence to the Corinthians. We believe he wrote at least a total of 4, but we know of 2. These are some of the ruins there. Corinth was quite a large city, and because it was a port city, it had a pretty bad reputation. Most port cities do. I'm from New Orleans, and New Orleans has a terrible reputation as a port city. As a matter of fact, it was known to be pretty bawdy and a lot of kind of a Las Vegas or just a real bawdy reputation. As a matter of fact, a lot of licentious behavior going on, gambling, drinking, prostitution, all that kind of thing. And it was sort of a phrase in there when you were engaged in that kind of behavior, they called it to make like a Corinthian if you were doing that kind of behavior. But there was this is part of the remains of Corinth, and if you look, this is one of the columns, and this was sort of one of the places my instructor pointed out, our guide pointed out about the different types of capitals for Greek columns and the orders. They're called the orders of columns. And there's many different kinds. There's, of course, Doric is probably, and Ionic are the most common, but they're very different time, and Corinthian columns, because they're from Corinth. That can be quite beautiful. There was a huge temple. There's a interesting. You can learn a lot about the statuary. Now, this, of course, there's no head, no arms, but look what you learn about women's garments and how they were worn. I just couldn't get over how could they carve marble to look so natural, like really the folds of cloth just draped all along, just falling so naturally and so beautifully. This is interesting. Paul mentions that there was a synagogue, at least one in Corinth, and this came from a synagogue, a first century synagogue in Corinth. Right here you can see these are menorah. You see them right there? And this is Greek writing, but it does say Hebrews in it. That's my husband right there, not his best side. What I was really surprised, I had not known that. I pictured all that beautiful Greek marble being white and pristine and, like we think of in Washington, D.C., but no, the ancients used to paint it. And this is marble that had been painted and actually was buried because of an earthquake, and retains a lot of its original color. This was very common. This is the Parthenon, parts of it were originally painted red and black. We now know that because of microscopic samples, but in antiquity, most of these buildings, the white marble was just a building material, and then they painted it on top of it. This was so strange. There's a temple to Asclepius. Asclepius was the god of healing. And these are votive offerings. When you were healed, or if you wanted the gods Asclepius to heal a certain body part, you would donate a votive part of that body part and to be healed. And so I guess to let them know what body part needed to be healed. So there were lots of these there, and this is just a sample of the ones that were there. But what it was is it kind of gave me goosebumps as I looked at this. Strange as it is, there was something familiar about it, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then it hit me. I grew up in New Orleans, and New Orleans has some unusual traditions. There's a cemetery in New Orleans, St. Roch Cemetery, and it too has a tradition for healing. And look at this. People leave votive offerings. Now here you've got people who were healed, who left their braces and things like that, but the same thing. Lame people, people who were healed of problems with their heart, with their stomach, and they left it all at the cemetery. See, this is the St. Roch Cemetery in New Orleans. Of course, St. Roch Cemetery has a history, has an Italian background, which is Mediterranean. So I guess maybe some of those Mediterranean traditions that evolved at the ancient Greeks continued on through the Italians and other Mediterranean people to be transported to New Orleans and practiced well into the 20th century. Kind of strange, huh? This is the Temple of Apollo. The Temple of Apollo is actually the oldest temple that existed in Corinth. It predated the other temples that were there by about 500 years. It was it was already considered ancient at the time of Paul. And Apollo is a god of prophecy that's related to prophecy. He's also very closely tied with the Oracle at Delphi, which is not that far away. I talked about that last week. And so it was, and it actually, Paul talks about having walked by this temple and walked on these stairs. These are huge monolithic columns, and they're all cut. The difference with these columns is instead of being cut out of stone that are like barrels stacked on top of each other, these are single stones, and they're still standing. It's very, very impressive. They're huge. That's me. Oh my gosh. I look like such a dork. What can I say? I haven't changed all that much. I'm still a dorky looking person. Isn't it funny how we never like pictures of ourselves? Well, this was very impressive. 2,500 years. Awesome. These stairs are also 2,500 years old. And Paul would have walked down these stairs. And here again, I had that wonderful feeling of being able to walk in the footsteps of Paul. Awesome, awesome. Now this was pretty interesting. You can't really appreciate what this is, but right here there's a channel that runs, and there was a, I don't know, some kind of little temple or something that sat on top of it. But what it is, it was like the priest would pour water in a fountain when it was asked a question. The water would run through, and it would turn blue or red on the other side, depending on what the answer to the question was. It was very magical. Well, turns out there was it looked like nobody could fit in there, but there was a tiny little place where somebody could squeeze in down there, and they would listen to the question, and they could dump in red or blue dye according to whatever was going on. But to whatever question was answer was needed for that question. Now this here is, they had all along the stoa or the marketplace, they had workshops like this. This one's been reconstructed. All the rest of them have tumbled down, but this is the kind of workshop they had. We know that Paul worked during his time in Corinth. He didn't allow anybody to pay his way. He didn't want to accept patronage. Whereas he had accepted patronage when he was in Philippi, he didn't accept it when he was in Corinth for some reason. He decided instead to ply his trade as a tent maker. Near Corinth, there was the Isthmian Games, and they were very popular, second only to the Olympian Games. And so not only did the army need tents, but also visitors to the games, when they would come for the games, would need tents. So there was a big tent making business there. Now, Paul was a Roman citizen, and because Corinth was a Roman city, his Roman citizenship would have made operating a business here very easy for him. My seminary professor, Dr. Witherington, pointed out that operating a shop would there on the stoa in the marketplace would have made it very easy for him to meet people of all social ranks. Whereas if he'd accepted patronage, it would have put more limitations on him. For example, one of the people we know he met was Erastus, was a very famous convert of his. He was a city tax collector, and perhaps one of the ways he might have met him was he came by to collect his taxes, and Paul had the opportunity to convert him. You know, we do know one thing. Paul used whatever opportunity presented itself in order to convert people. And also know that while he was here in Corinth, he worked with Priscilla and Aquila, who were also tent makers. They were Jews who had been in Rome but were expelled by the Edict of Claudius, and they were forced to leave Rome. So and they became his co-workers here. Now this is the Acro-Corinth, and that just means the hill overlooking Corinth, and that was the site of the temple of Aphrodite. So all over Corinth, there were all kinds of gods. You're going to remember, too, it was a port city. So people were coming in from all over the place. They brought gods from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from all the ends of the Gallic gods from all over the empire, not just the traditional Greek and Roman gods. There was all these different kinds of messages that were getting preached here. But Paul managed to deal with it. He ended up putting up with a lot of suffering and a lot of trials, but he stayed in Corinth about 2.5 years. And he had co-workers like Priscilla and Aquila and Silas and others, and they had a lot of conflict, but he ended up hanging in there. Now, he did have problems. He did have headaches. He actually got dragged before. He had converted people in the Jewish synagogue, and they got real upset about that. He converted the leader of the synagogue, and they dragged him before the proconsul. That would be the governor, basically the leader of the city of Corinth, at the Bema. This is the site of the Bema. There's nothing here now, but there would have been a marble area and a big platform here, and there would have been a seat for the governor to sit on. And the proconsul the Roman proconsul would have been there, and they dragged Paul before him, and they complained what was going on, and Paul pulled out his little citizenship card, and once the proconsul heard that it was Jews who were not citizens complaining about Paul, who was Jewish but was also a citizenship, about Jewish issues, he said, look, this doesn't have anything to do with me, and he threw the case out. And so my seminary professor, that's Dr. Witherington, of course you got to remember this was 20 years ago almost now, and he used to lecture us. That was what was so neat about this trip, to be lectured, to be in those places, to know that Paul stood right in the same area. Probably Priscilla and Aquila and Erastus, they were all there. Yeah. Now, this is really cool. This is actually an inscription from the 1st century that has the name Erastus in there. It's one of the few, if not the only, it used to be the only inscription of someone who was in the Bible, you know, besides someone like Pontius Pilate or the emperor, of someone mentioned in the Bible. And what it really says is Erastus paved this parking lot. But it does prove that Erastus was a real person, that he was the tax collector for the city of Corinth at the time that the book of Acts says he was. And I was just really stunned. I mean, I kind of bent down and I traced the letters. Boy, they really dug them deep, didn't they? And I wondered, you know, did Erastus do the same thing? Did he come by and inspect to see if they'd gotten his name, if they did it right? He wanted to make sure it would still be there 2,000 years later for all posterity to see, so everybody would know that he paved this parking lot. Wow. It's neat when you can kind of make connections. I was so overwhelmed. Yeah. Well, you see, Paul used to go to big cosmopolitan areas when he could, urban empires. He went to Ephesus, to Corinth, to Rome. He spent a lot of time. He sought out. Yes, he preached to the rich, but he also preached to the poor. The rich had the advantage of they could provide houses that were large enough to sponsor gatherings for church meetings and things like that. But everyone, and then when he preached that people were all equal when they became Christians. It was really, really powerful. He preached to people up and down the social scale. Well, we moved on to Athens after that. Oh man, this is the view of Athens. There's the Parthenon, which is the hill, of course, where all the temples sit. And the most famous is this temple right here. And it's Athens has a population. The city of Athens today has a population of over 3 million. It's been known to be populated for, I don't know, since about maybe between about the 10th century, before, 7 to 10 centuries BC. I'm not exactly sure. Very impressive. This right here is called the Areopagus. Now this was an important area in pre-classical times, about the 5th century BC. Now Paul actually preached here. There's me standing next to a bronze plaque that talks about, has, I think, Paul's speech on it that he gave before the Areopagus. Now in ancient times, you see how it's a big giant rock? In ancient times, all the free men who could vote, and you had to be not only free, but you had to be a landowner, and and they had rules in Athens. The voting, in order to be able to vote, they would come up here on top of this rock, and you could easily see who was free, who was up there, and they would have debates, and then when they voted, they would, it was clear to see, and this kind of debate continued. Now, by the time of Paul, there's some people who believe, some scholars believe, that they really weren't up on top of the rock anymore, that they had moved this somewhere down near the marketplace. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it is very, very impressive. And Paul got up there, and he figured out how to speak to them. You see, in Athens, you weren't allowed to preach about gods that weren't approved. See, he wanted to talk about Jesus Christ, but he couldn't because he wasn't on the approved list of gods you could talk about. Well, he walked around the city, and there were shrines to all kinds of gods, and he found one that was to the unknown God. See, about centuries before, I don't know how long before, they'd had a plague, and they prayed to every god they knew of, and the plague didn't get lifted. So finally they figured they must have missed a god, so they set up altars to an unknown god, and they prayed to that one, and the plague went away. So they still had these altars to an unknown god. So Paul says, I see how religious all you people are. He's preaching before the ruling council at the Areopagus, and he says, I see how religious you people are, and I respect that, and I honor that, and I see you even preach to the unknown God. Well, I'm here to tell you about that unknown God, and about Jesus Christ, your Savior, his Son, your Savior. Now, it's the God who made the world and everything in it, and it is the Lord of heaven, and does not live in temples built by human hands. Paul started with people right where they are. He found common ground, and then he just took off. Well, this is a man dressed in traditional Greek. This is what Greek soldiers wore. I suppose this is what sort of their traditional dress uniform. I think it is still their traditional dress uniform. Now, we went ahead and went to the top and you have to see the Parthenon. And I was surprised. I didn't know the Parthenon was all rocks, but it is, up on top of there. And at the time I was there, you got to remember 20 years ago, it was undergoing some restoration. I understand a lot of that has been completed. And but still, it was very impressive. These are some of the other temples that are up there. And this is Dr. Witherington, and his sister was with him on the trip. I thought these were very impressive. It's funny. My uncle was an architect, and he was very much into Louisiana architecture. And of course, in Louisiana architecture, the antebellum period is the period of all the plantations and things like that, and that's all Greek revival. And he had studied as the history of Louisiana architecture, Greek revival. So I knew a lot about Greek revival at one time, and this is what Greek revival came from. Exactly these kinds of drawings. And I've seen many, many buildings with exactly these motifs. Of course, y'all have too, if you've ever been to government buildings in and around Washington, D.C. There's my husband right there. Once again, I told you you'd see him a lot with his video camera. Certainly you will. This was very impressive. This is the view from on top of the Parthenon, looking down. And this is what I took more pictures of on that trip than anything else. My finger. It's a good thing I was shooting with a digital camera. I took more pictures of my finger than anything else. Well, there was a museum. This is actually an owl that was a companion of Perseus, given to him by one of the goddesses, and I can't remember which one. And it's interesting. And these are from the frieze that was on all around the Parthenon. Although many of the marbles that were up there originally were taken by Lord Elgin in the 19th century to the British Museum, and they still have them. And that's a source of great debate between Greece and England. For a long time, England said that they couldn't give them back to them because Greece didn't have any place to properly store them and protect them from the elements. So they built this museum. That was 20 years ago they built this museum. When I was there, the museum had just been completed, but as far as I know, the British Museum hasn't given back the marbles that go with the Parthenon. So this is what it looked like. It had a huge statue of Athena, who is the goddess, who was the patron deity of Athens. She was huge. She was dressed in gold, and she was made of ivory. And this is what was left at the time in 2002. And here's all our fun guys. I always thought these three looked like Curly, Larry, and Moe, the Three Stooges. I took so many pictures. And there's little traces of color. Well, after that, we went down to the Plotka, which is basically the old city. And we were going to go eat at a restaurant. And there was some beautiful sights along the way. This is gorgeous bougainvillea. It grows everywhere there. Of course, we were there in the summer, at the end of summer. We were there at the end of August, and it was beautiful. And the scenes are just gorgeous. We were looking for the restaurant, but my seminary professor got lost, and so we ended up wandering around the Plotka for about 45 minutes, which was getting old, but finally he found the restaurant he wanted. He has a terrible sense of direction. He lost his, we wandered around Jerusalem for about 45 minutes too one night, trying to figure out how to get to the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. He has a terrible sense of direction. But we got to the restaurant he wanted, and we finished off with a glass of wine and some very good traditional Greek dish called moussaka. So join us next week for part 3. All right. Well, next week we'll have part 3. I'll see you until then. God bless you.